two. I'm going to scooch over. All right. Now we're talking about hot or cold. Temperature is another time in real life that we would use negative numbers. Temperature is commonly measured using one of two scales, Celsius or Fahrenheit. In the United States, the Fahrenheit system continues to be the accepted standard for non-scientific use. All other countries have adopted Celsius as the primary scale in use. The thermometer shows how both scales are related. So the thermometer on your paper looks something like this, and we've got Celsius on the right and Fahrenheit on the left, and you can tell by the initials that represent that at the top. A says the boiling point of water is 100 degrees Celsius. Where is 100 degrees Celsius located on the thermometer? So if we're looking at the thermometer, we're looking for 100 degrees Celsius. So I go to the Celsius side. Here's 0. So 100 degrees is not shown on our thermometer. A thermometer is an example of a vertical number line. So B says, on the vertical number line, describe the position of the integer that represents 100 degrees Celsius. So we know number lines continue on forever in both directions. So if I were going to extend this number line to show 100 degrees Celsius, where would it be? Well, this is negative 30, so it wouldn't go down. Here we have 50 degrees Celsius. I know that 50 is halfway to 100. So this distance is half. I would have to match that same distance to be able to put 100 degrees Celsius on there. And I don't know that I go up that high, so it would have to be, that's about as close as I can get, and that's still a little short. So just knowing that it's twice this distance from 0. C says, write each temperature as an integer. So again, an integer is any whole number, and it can be positive or negative. So on C, the first integer that we need to represent, the temperature shown on the thermometer in degrees Fahrenheit. So the temperature is shown on the thermometer. So on your thermometer, the mercury is up to this line, and we want it in Fahrenheit, so I'll look not at Celsius, but over at Fahrenheit, and I can see that it matches up with 100. So the temperature on the thermometer is 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So this little symbol means degrees, and that's our unit of measurement, and the capital F represents Fahrenheit, which is the scale that we're using. So the temperature shown on the thermometer in degrees Celsius. Okay, so Celsius here is not matching up with one of the numbers that are labeled, but it does have a tick mark there. So I need to figure out what number does this tick mark represent. So I need to check what is the scale being used for Celsius. What does each tick mark represent? Well, some students make the mistake, they say, well, it's 1 less than 40, so it must be 39 degrees. The problem is, if each tick mark only represented 1, this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But this does not represent 5, it represents 10. So I know the scale is not 1. I would have to count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So each tick mark has to represent 2 degrees. So if this is 40, and I come down 1 tick mark, I need to come down 2 degrees, which would be 38 degrees Celsius. And lastly, the freezing point of water in degrees Celsius. Well, if you look on your temperature, on your thermometer, it has an arrow pointing that says the freezing point. And they want to know what it is in Celsius. So looking at Celsius, it would be 0 degrees Celsius. All right. If someone tells you that your body temperature is 98 and 6/10 degrees, what scale is being used and how do you know? So this question is asking, is your body temperature 98 and 6 tenths degrees Celsius or 98 and 6 tenths degrees Fahrenheit? And how would you know? Well, of course, the answer is Fahrenheit. And there's two ways that we know that. Number one, we're in the United States, and we know that in the United States, Fahrenheit is the scale that we typically use. So that would make sense. It also told us at the very beginning that the boiling point of water is 100 degrees Celsius. And so if water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, and our body temperature were 98 degrees Celsius, that means our insides would be close to boiling. And I think we all know that that does not sound safe, so probably our insides are not close to boiling, and it only makes sense that our temperature would be in Fahrenheit. Does the temperature 0 degrees mean the same thing on both scales? I want you to push pause and write a sentence to answer that question. Okay, so hopefully you've already had a chance to think about what does 0 represent. And up until this point, we've always thought of 0 as not having any value, of basically meaning nothing. But you'll learn, now that we're using both sides of the number line, that 0 does have a value, that it does represent something. So when we're looking at 0 degrees Celsius and 0 degrees Fahrenheit, we can see that they're not at the same point on the scale. 0 degrees Celsius is the freezing point of water. But 0 degrees Fahrenheit is not the freezing point of water. Water would be frozen because it's colder than the freezing point, but the freezing point of water in Fahrenheit is 32 degrees. So the way that we have to think about that is if we stood at a wall and we put our arms out into two different rooms. If this room, my arm is in this room and it's 0 degrees Celsius, and my arm is in this room and it's 0 degrees Fahrenheit, would my arms feel the same temperature? Or would one of them be colder? If we look at where it is on the scale, 0 degrees Celsius would be 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So for my arms to feel the same temperature, it would be 0 degrees Celsius and 32 degrees Fahrenheit. But this arm is not 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It's only 0 degrees Fahrenheit. It's 32 degrees less than that. So the 0 degrees Fahrenheit is colder than 0 degrees Celsius, which makes sense if we look at it on this scale. Because if the temperature is being measured, the lower it is, it would be closer to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it would have to get warmer to be 0 degrees Celsius. So 0 degrees does not have the same value on both scales. Before we go over to the back, I want to bring your attention to another way that we can use negative numbers. If I said the account balance is negative $25 below 0, there's something wrong with this. It's redundant. I'm telling you that it's negative and below 0. Both of those, both this symbol and that phrase mean the same thing. So it's unnecessary to have both in the sentence. So what we need to do is only choose one. Instead, I could say the account balance is negative $25. Or I could say the account balance is $25 below 0. Either of these sentences is correct, but having both the negative and below 0 is not correct. So make sure that you're not being redundant whenever you write a sentence describing a negative number. Go ahead and practice on your paper. We're going to go away from talking about money and talk about elevation. The cave is negative 240 feet below sea level. Rewrite that sentence so that it doesn't have both the negative sign and below sea level. Push pause until you have that done, and you can write it anywhere on your paper. Okay, so you should have been able to come up with the cave is 240 feet below sea level. That was the easiest way that you could have written the sentence correctly. If you wanted to use the negative sign, you could say the cave's elevation is negative 240 feet. So either of those would be correct. Just keep in mind you can't have both the negative sign and then below sea level. Okay, talking again about the value of 0, we can look at how does 0 have value when we're talking about elevation. So we're talking about elevation, and let's say that the cave is negative 240 feet, so that would be down here. So all of these negative numbers, they are negative, so we know that they are below sea level. So then, what does that tell us about the positive numbers? We know that they are above sea level. So what would 0 represent in this situation when we're talking about elevation? If these are below sea level and these are above sea level, 0 represents sea level. Okay? We can also talk about, so anytime you use different situations, 0 is always going to have value. It's going to represent something, but it's going to change depending on the situation. So you need to have to analyze what it means. It doesn't stand for nothing anymore. Another example of that would be a football player lost 10 yards on a play. He got tackled. So a loss of 10 yards. So what integer would represent that? A loss would actually be going back, so it would be negative 10. So if I were to plot the point at negative 10 on the number line to show the loss on that play, what would 0 represent? Some of the guesses that students made, they thought it was 0 yards. Well, if you're familiar with football, there's not a place on the field for 0 yards. They said, oh, maybe it's the goal line. Well, we just said that the player lost 10 yards. We don't know how close they were to the goal line. So finally we were able to figure out, well, if they lost 10 yards on the play, then this 0 is where the play started. So you could say that it's the starting point, but if you're familiar with football, you'll know that 0 represents the line of scrimmage. So 0 does have value, it does represent something, and depending on the situations, you're going to have to determine what that means. So what I want you to do now is turn it over onto the back. We've got exercises 3 through 5. So exercise 3, it has the list of words here, and you're going to put, does it represent a positive or a negative transaction? So make sure that you put all of the words into one of the two boxes. Exercise number 4 says to write an integer to represent the following situations. So you're going to do A through F. You're going to write the positive or negative whole number that would represent that situation. Lastly, you're going to describe a situation that you could use the integer negative 15. So I just made up a situation where we used the integer negative 10. So you can use any situation that you can think of, but the integer in your event will be negative 15. And then determine what would 0 represent for the situation that you have created. So push pause until you have completed exercises 3 through 5. Okay, now that you have 3 through 5 done, here are what your answers should be. So on number 3, these words should be in the box for a positive number. These words should be in the box for a negative number. And these are your integers for A through F on number 4. 5 is going to be vary by each person. So this is what you need to know to do your lesson 2 problem set. Work hard.